In the summer of 2008, two hikers cutting across the Wind River Range stumbled on a sight that stopped them cold. 8 rusted bicycles, piled neatly at the mouth of a forgotten cave. Their frames were warped with time, their chains tangled like vines, and each one carried the weight of a story 18 years unfinished. Everyone in Fremont County knew what this meant. The missing children had been found. Or at least, the first shadow of the truth had finally surfaced. The story begins not in 2008, but nearly 2 decades earlier. It was June 14, 1990, when the small reservation town of Red Valley, Wyoming, woke to a blue sky that felt like summer had finally arrived. The air was light, the grass sharp with morning dew, and the last day of school had ended the afternoon before. 8 native children, cousins, neighbors, friends, hopped on their bicycles that morning with a plan. They were headed to the edge of town, where an old dirt track cut across cattle fields and led toward Lander, nearly 15 miles away. Their parents assumed it was a harmless adventure, a simple summer ride. The kids promised to be home by dinner. They never came back. By nightfall, worry had turned to panic. Search parties fanned across the reservation, scouring roads, trails, and rivers. A storm rolled in by midnight, covering the land in sheets of rain that washed away any tracks the children might have left. The sheriff's office put out a brief statement the next day. No foul play suspected. The children likely lost their way in the mountains. But their bicycles were gone. Their footprints vanished. And with them, so too did the hope of a quiet summer in Red Valley. For days, volunteers searched. Families lit bonfires on the hillsides, praying their light would guide the children home. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters hovered over ridges, but no trace was found. By the end of June, the search scaled back. By July, officials had called it quits. 8 children had vanished in broad daylight, and not a single clue had surfaced. Rumors filled the silence. Some whispered about wild animals. Others said the kids had been taken by strangers. But on the reservation, people spoke in lower tones. They remembered stories of the nearby boarding school, shuttered just a few years earlier, and the things children used to whisper about caves in the hills, caves where they were sometimes taken as punishment, caves where the walls remembered what others wanted forgotten. But with no proof, the case dissolved into dust. By the mid-1990s, the missing children became another unsolved mystery, a wound carried mostly by their families, ignored by the state, and eventually erased from headlines. Until 2008. That summer, when the hikers stumbled upon the bicycles, it wasn't just the metal that had survived. It was the memory. The frames were twisted, but names were still scratched into the paint. Raymond L., Jesse Two Eagles, Maria Red Sky. Forensic teams soon confirmed what families had known in their bones for 18 years. The children hadn't simply vanished. They had been hidden, and hidden in plain sight. The cave mouth gaped like an unhealed wound, its shadows swallowing the light. But investigators quickly realized the bicycles were only the beginning. What lay inside the cavern would challenge everything the community and the authorities thought they knew. What happened to those 8 children in 1990? Who led them into the hills? And why did it take nearly 2 decades for the first truth to be found? The answers would not come quickly. But when they did, they revealed something far darker than anyone imagined. The last confirmed sighting of the 8 children came at 9:45 a.m. on June 14, 1990. A local shopkeeper remembered them pedaling past his store on Main Street, laughing, shoving each other, the way kids do when freedom tastes like sunshine and the summer feels endless. There were 8 in total. Raymond Littlebird, 13, the oldest, often looked at as the group's leader. Maria Red Sky, 12, sharp-eyed and stubborn, who had begged her mother for weeks to let her ride with the others. Jesse Two Eagles, 11, Raymond's cousin, quick to joke but quieter around strangers. Lena White Elk, 11, who loved to draw and carried a sketchbook everywhere. Anthony Tony Blackhorse, 10, mischievous and fearless, always at the front of the pack. Caleb Yazzie, 10, shy but eager to belong. Elena Swiftwater, 9, Lena's younger sister who idolized Maria. Samuel Sammy Tallchief, 9, the youngest, whose bike was slightly too big for him, but who insisted he could keep up. 8 children, 8 bicycles, 1 promise. We'll be back before dark. By early afternoon, when the children hadn't returned for lunch, some parents assumed they had gone farther than usual, maybe to the river or the far cattle fields. But by 4 o'clock, worry set in. Fathers drove pickup trucks down back roads. Mothers stood at the edge of fields, calling out names into the hot wind. Nothing. By nightfall, search parties were organized. Dozens of community members walked the trails with flashlights. Pickup trucks and ATVs combed the sagebrush plains. The only sound was the constant sweep of beams through the dark, punctuated by voices yelling the names of the missing. The sheriff's office, under Sheriff Dale Harmon, didn't arrive until nearly midnight. Harmon was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a reputation for being by the book. His book, however, rarely included listening to Native families. His first public statement was brief. "Children get lost in these parts all the time. We'll find 'em." But the weather had other plans. A thunderstorm rolled in around 2 a.m., turning dirt tracks into rivers of mud. Rain hammered down so hard it erased any chance of finding bicycle tracks. By morning, the only thing left were washed-out gullies and silence. The official search lasted 7 days. Helicopters buzzed the ridges, dogs were brought in from Cheyenne, and volunteers scoured fields on horseback. Families stayed up through the night, keeping bonfires lit on high ground, hoping the children might see them and find their way back. But every day ended the same, nothing. No bikes, no clothing, no footprints, just a silence that grew heavier with each passing hour. On the 8th day, Sheriff Harmon declared the case cold. His statement, printed in the Casper Star-Tribune, read, "It is our professional assessment that the children became lost in the high terrain during the storm. After this much time without food or shelter, we do not expect survivors." Families were outraged. No bodies had been found, no concrete evidence uncovered, yet the sheriff was already writing their children off as dead. One father, Leon Red Sky, Maria's dad, told reporters, "They want us to stop asking questions. But how can we stop when they haven't even found where our kids went?" His words would echo for decades. By late 1990, the disappearance of the 8 children had already become a story everyone told differently. Some locals swore they saw a strange truck parked near the old boarding school the morning of the disappearance. Others whispered about caves in the foothills, places the children had been warned never to go. On the reservation, the elders spoke of something darker, not monsters or spirits, but men. Men who had worked at the now-closed Red Valley Residential School, who still roamed the town, still held influence. The school had shut down in 1987, just 3 years before, after mounting accusations of abuse, neglect, and forced assimilation practices. Many families believed that what happened to their children was connected to that building, that history. But when they spoke up, they were dismissed as paranoid or stirring trouble. By the mid-1990s, the case was little more than a painful memory in Fremont County. The sheriff's office stopped returning calls. Newspapers stopped running stories. For the state of Wyoming, the missing children were a closed chapter, but not for their families. Parents kept their children's rooms intact. Birthdays were marked with empty chairs at the table. And every June 14th, Relatives would gather in a circle at the old school gymnasium, light candles, and speak the names of the 8 children into the dark. For them, the waiting was worse than mourning. Mourning required certainty, and certainty never came. The Red Valley 8, as they were quietly labeled in police files, were eventually listed as presumed dead. Their case was archived, sealed in manila folders, and placed in a backroom cabinet at the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. But those who looked closer, years later, would notice something strange. Key documents were missing. The original incident reports from June 14th were gone. The notes from the helicopter searches gone. Even the statements from parents had been thinned out, some reduced to single-page summaries with details erased. Someone had tampered with the record, but in 1990, no one outside the families noticed, and if they did, they chose not to. There was one place that seemed to linger in whispers, Crow Ridge Cave, a yawning mouth in the Wind River Range, 2 miles from the old boarding school. Children had spoken about it for decades. Some said they were taken there for discipline when they broke rules. Others claimed it was a hiding place, a shadow the adults didn't talk about. During the 1990 search, no official record shows the cave was checked. And maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was neglect. Or maybe, as some later believed, it was intentional. Because 18 years later, in 2008, when 2 hikers stumbled across the bicycles stacked neatly at that very cave mouth, the families realized what they had feared all along. The children hadn't been lost. They had been taken, and the cave had been waiting to speak. By the summer of 2008, most people in Fremont County had stopped speaking about the 8 missing children. Their photographs, once pinned to corkboards in the sheriff's office, had long been boxed up or misplaced. The parents who were still alive had grown quieter, their grief folded inward, carried like a private weight. But on July 22nd, 2 hikers from Lander cut across the southern ridges of the Wind River Range and stumbled on something that would change everything. They had been following a game trail when they came upon it, a clearing of stone where the mountain dropped into a shallow ravine. At the far end was a dark cave mouth, wide enough for a truck to fit through, framed by brush and fallen timber. And there, stacked deliberately at the entrance, were bicycles. 8 of them. At first, the hikers thought it was some kind of junk pile until they noticed how neatly the frames were arranged, almost ceremonial, like someone had set them there with intention. Rust coated the chains and handlebars. Tires had collapsed inward, rubber rotted to brittle threads. But on some, paint still clung faintly to the frames. Red, blue, green. Names were scratched into the metal in shaky letters. Maria R., Tony B., Sammy T. The hikers froze. They didn't need to check the dates or the records. Everyone in the county knew the story of the 8 children. Everyone knew the case had never been solved. They pulled out a cell phone and called the sheriff's office. Within hours, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape. When investigators arrived, they treated the scene like a crime scene, though 18 years of wind and rain had stripped much of the evidence. Still, the bicycles were catalogued carefully, one by one, lifted into evidence vans as if the frames themselves carried the voices of the children who had once ridden them. Forensic teams swept the cave entrance, sifting through dirt, stones, and debris. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, just an old cavern with decades of dust. But deeper inside, the air grew colder, the walls closed in, and in the far chamber, carved into the rock with something sharp, were faint markings. They weren't random scratches. They were words. One of the technicians leaned close with a flashlight and traced the grooves with his eyes. There, in crooked letters, someone had etched a phrase, "We were here." The words hit like a hammer. In the following weeks, the bicycles were confirmed by serial numbers and descriptions given in 1990 reports. Families were called in for identification, though most didn't need the numbers. They recognized the scratches their children had carved into the paint, the stickers still clinging to metal, the color choices that matched birthdays and Christmas gifts. For many parents, it was the first tangible proof in nearly 2 decades that their children's last day had been real. Not a dream, not a story erased by police statements, but something that left scars in metal and stone. The news made state headlines, then national ones. Reporters poured into Red Valley, chasing the story of the bicycle cave. But behind the cameras and lights, families were forced to reopen wounds they had carried for almost 20 years. One mother, her voice breaking, told a journalist, "They said they were lost, but these bikes, they were taken. Somebody put them there." And that was the central question. Who had placed the bicycles at the cave mouth, and why? The sheriff's office announced a renewed investigation. Sheriff Harmon had retired years earlier, and now a younger man, Sheriff David Keller, took the lead. Keller promised transparency, promised to follow the evidence wherever it led, but almost immediately, families noticed the same hesitations they'd seen before. Records were missing. Some files had never existed, and when Keller was asked why the cave hadn't been searched in 1990, his only response was, "There's no record it was on the search map." No record, the same phrase that had followed the case from the beginning. But not everyone was content with official answers. Among the reporters who came to cover the discovery was Nora Yazzie, a young journalist with ties to the reservation. Her uncle had been Caleb Yazzie's father. She had grown up hearing whispers about the disappearance, the silence, the way adults avoided talking about it when children asked. For Nora, the cave wasn't just a story, it was family. She walked the site herself 2 days after the discovery, standing in the mouth of the cave, looking at the dark stone and the faint words carved inside. "We were here." Her hands trembled as she traced the letters with her fingers. This was not the end of the story. This was the beginning. In her notebook, she wrote down the questions that mattered. If the children rode their bikes into the hills, why were the bicycles stacked neatly instead of abandoned in panic? Why had no official search logs included Crow Ridge Cave, a landmark known to locals for decades? And who had silenced the families in 1990 when they insisted the children would never have gone that far on their own? The bicycles were proof of presence, but they were also proof of control. Someone had placed them there, not scattered, not discarded, but arranged. It was a message. As night fell on the reservation, families gathered once more in the gymnasium, just as they had every June for 18 years. Only this time, instead of lighting candles for the missing, they laid photographs of the rusted bicycles on a table in the center. Mothers cried softly. Fathers stared at the floor. The younger relatives, nieces, nephews, cousins who had never met the 8, looked at the images with wide, confused eyes. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the silence cracked. People began to talk about the boarding school, about the caves, about the officials who had dismissed them, about the possibility that what happened in 1990 had never been an accident, but something planned. Nora Yazzie was there, recording every word in her notebook. She didn't know where the trail would lead, but she knew one thing. The cave had given something back, and it was demanding to be followed. In the weeks that followed the discovery of the bicycles, the official investigation moved at a cautious pace. Sheriff Keller gave carefully worded press conferences, insisting that all possibilities are being considered. Yet in Red Valley, the families of the missing children felt something different. The same quiet stalling, the same weight of bureaucracy that had strangled the search back in 1990. Files still couldn't be found. Maps were incomplete. Notes from search leaders simply ended mid-sentence. But outside the official channels, a parallel investigation began to take shape. At its center was Nora Yazzie. She was 28 then, a reporter for a small paper out of Casper. Her editor had sent her north expecting little more than a feature piece, a local human interest story to run in the Sunday section. But from the moment Nora stood at the mouth of Crow Ridge Cave, something shifted. This wasn't a human interest story, it was her family's story. And no matter how far she had to go, she was going to follow it. Her first step was the archives. The reservation office kept old records in a converted schoolhouse, files stacked in metal cabinets that smelled of dust and mildew. With permission from tribal council, Nora began pulling every document tied to June 1990. Sheriff's reports, school attendance logs, search maps, and the handful of newspaper clippings that still existed. The first discrepancy leapt out quickly. The official record listed the 8 children as last seen leaving school grounds. But the date didn't match. School had ended for the summer on June 13th. The children vanished on June 14th. There had been no school that day, no roll call, no bus, no dismissal. Yet in the files, someone had recorded their names on an attendance sheet as if they'd been present. Nora stared at the page for a long time. Each name was written in the same careful handwriting. Each box checked neatly, as though someone wanted it to look official. She photographed the sheet and circled it in her notes. The next inconsistency came from search maps. The sheriff's office had marked off the valleys, the rivers, and even stretches of highway, but Crow Ridge Cave wasn't on a single page. When Nora asked the current deputy why, he shrugged. No record of it. That phrase again. But on the reservation there were records, oral ones. Nora spent evenings visiting the families, sitting in their kitchens and living rooms, asking them to tell her again what they remembered. One father, now with gray hair and hands calloused from decades of ranch work, described how he'd told Sheriff Harmon about the cave in 1990. We begged them to look there. They told us it was too dangerous, too unstable, but we knew. We knew those kids went that way. Another mother remembered hearing from her youngest son, who hadn't vanished, that older children sometimes talked about the caves as places teachers used to take them. Punishments, extra lessons, places where no one could hear. The more Nora listened, the clearer the picture became. The cave had not been an accident. The children had been led there, but who had led them? For that, Nora turned to the school itself. Though it had closed in 1993, many of the buildings still stood on the edge of town, empty, their windows broken, hallways filled with dust. With council permission, she walked through one of the old classrooms. The chalkboard still held faint writing. Spelling words, long division, rules of conduct. She felt the air press heavy around her, as though the walls remembered every voice that had echoed there. In the basement of the main hall, she found something stranger. File cabinets chained shut, with locks that had rusted but not broken. She pried one open with a crowbar borrowed from her cousin. Inside were student records, attendance logs, and disciplinary reports, and tucked between folders was a small leather-bound ledger. It wasn't official, no labels, no signatures, just a journal. The handwriting was precise, each entry dated between 1987 and 1990. At first, it seemed ordinary, notes about the schedules, assignments, behavior issues, but as she read deeper, Nora's stomach knotted. June 12, 1990. Rumors spreading again about the older ones talking back. Need to separate them. June 13, 1990. Arrangements made for 8, tomorrow will be final. No names were written, no details beyond that, just a cold certainty in the phrasing, as if the writer already knew what was going to happen. Nora sat on the floor of the abandoned school for a long time, the journal trembling in her hands. Final. When she showed the ledger to Sheriff Keller, he dismissed it as inconclusive. But when she showed it to the families, their faces hardened. One mother whispered, "They knew, they planned it." The journal entries were enough to confirm Nora's path forward. She would not rely on the sheriff's office. She would piece this together herself, even if it meant crossing lines, even if it meant exposing names that had been buried for 18 years. Because now there was proof, faint, fragile, but real, that the disappearance of the children had not been a tragedy of chance. It had been deliberate, and somewhere, someone alive still knew why. Nora's first targets were the adults who had worked at Red Valley Boarding School in 1990. Most had long since left the reservation, scattering across Wyoming and Montana, some disappearing entirely into retirement or new lives. Tracking them wasn't easy, but newspapers, church bulletins, and even a few Social Security records gave her starting points. The first interview was with a former teacher named Walter Briggs. He had been in his late 30s in 1990, teaching math and geography. Now, he lived in a small house outside Riverton, his yard cluttered with rusted farm equipment. When Nora introduced herself, Briggs was polite, even warm. He seemed happy to talk about the old days. But when she mentioned June 14th, his face tightened. "I don't recall much," he said quickly. "School was ending. Things were hectic. You know how it is." Nora pressed. "But the records say you were there that day. You marked a student's present." Briggs shook his head. "That can't be right. Must be a mistake. I don't remember any of that." It was too smooth, too rehearsed. Nora left with a pit in her stomach. The second lead was tougher. A woman named Sister Margaret, who had been a nun at the school, refused to speak at all. When Nora knocked on her convent door in Billings, she was turned away without explanation. The pattern was clear: silence. Either carefully constructed or fiercely defensive. But silence can be louder than words. Back on the reservation, Nora cross-checked employment records with the journal she had found. One entry mentioned initials. Arrangements confirmed by WB and MR. Briggs matched the first. The second took longer, but eventually she found a name: Margaret Rourke. Sister Margaret. 2 names. 2 adults tied directly to the days leading up to the children's disappearance. And then came something she hadn't expected. A voice from the past. One afternoon, after publishing a short article in her paper about the rediscovery of the bicycles, Nora received a call. The voice on the other end was fragile, almost breaking. "I know what happened," the man whispered, "but I don't want to say it over the phone. Meet me tomorrow, the old train depot." The next day, she waited. The depot was empty, long abandoned, its windows shattered, pigeons roosting in the rafters. Just when she thought no one would come, an old pickup truck rolled in. The man who stepped out was thin, stooped, his skin weathered from decades of sun. His name was Daniel Gray, a former maintenance worker at the school. He didn't waste time. "I saw them that morning," he said. "All 8 of those kids. They weren't riding off for fun. They were told to follow Briggs. They trusted him. They had no choice." Nora's heart pounded. "And the cave?" Daniel nodded. His eyes brimmed with tears. "I saw them ride toward Crow Ridge. I didn't follow. I should have, but I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I asked questions. Afraid of losing my job. I thought maybe it was just a lesson, a scare. But when the news came that they were missing, I knew. I knew." His voice cracked. "And when we begged the sheriff to look at the caves, he said there was nothing there, nothing at all. But I had seen their bikes leaning against the rocks. I swear to God I saw them." Nora leaned forward, stunned. "Why didn't you say this before?" Daniel's hands trembled. "Because Sheriff Harmon told me if I spoke I'd be the next one to disappear, and back then I believed him." The admission was devastating. For 18 years the truth had been locked inside a man too terrified to speak, and yet, even in his confession, one piece didn't fit. If the bikes had been leaning against the rocks, why were they later piled neatly at the cave mouth? Who moved them, and why? As Daniel drove away, Nora scribbled notes, her hand shaking. The story was growing larger than she had imagined. This wasn't just about a disappearance. This was about a deliberate silencing, orchestrated not only by teachers but by law enforcement. Later that week, she confronted Sheriff Keller with what she'd learned. His jaw clenched as she recounted Daniel's testimony. He finally sighed. "Look, Nora, some people here don't want this dug up. It's going to hurt more than it heals." But Nora snapped back. "The families have been hurting for 18 years. The only thing left that can heal them is the truth." For the first time, Keller didn't argue. He just turned away, muttering, "Then you'd better be ready for what you find." That night, unable to sleep, Nora replayed Daniel's words. The image of 8 bicycles against stone, children being led into a cave, silence afterward. And then one more detail from the journal surfaced in her memory. June 13th, 1990. "Tomorrow will be final. Final." The word echoed through her thoughts as though carved into stone. Whatever had happened in that cave hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been chance. It had been the conclusion of something planned, and someone alive had carried that plan out. The next step in Nora's investigation was inevitable. She had to return to Crow Ridge Cave. The official excavation had stopped weeks after the bicycles were found. Authorities had sent a small forensic team, but the cave was declared too unstable, a risk to personnel. They'd cordoned it off with yellow tape and declared the case pending further resources. Then, predictably, nothing further happened. But for Nora, waiting wasn't an option. On a cool October morning in 2008, she hiked to the ridge with a small group. Her cousin David, who knew the terrain well. An elder named Thomas Begay, who insisted the cave had to be approached with prayer and respect. And a cameraman from her newspaper, reluctantly convinced this was worth filming. The cave mouth yawned like a black wound in the limestone. The bicycles were still there, piled in an unnatural heap, their frames eaten with rust. Some handlebars were bent as if by force. A few had colorful ribbons tied to them, now faded to gray. Time had not erased their smallness, their innocence. Thomas murmured a blessing in Diné, sprinkling cedar ash at the entrance. Only after he finished did they step inside. The cave air was cold, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Their flashlights revealed graffiti from kids who had once wandered inside, initials, crude drawings, dates. But farther back, beyond a narrow bend, the walls grew smooth and the floor damp. It was there that David noticed something lodged in the rock. A small rusted tin box, half buried in silt. He pried it loose and handed it to Nora. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were scraps of paper, folded tightly. Some were blank with moisture stains, but one had writing still legible. In messy pencil, a child had written, "If we don't come back, tell my mom I'm sorry." There was no name, just the shaky scrawl of someone too young to write steadily, someone who had been afraid. Nora's throat closed. She felt the weight of the note in her chest, heavier than the box itself. This was no longer abstract. These were not just names in an old file. These were children who had known something terrible was coming. She pressed on. Deeper inside, the tunnel widened into a chamber. The floor was uneven, scattered with rocks, but one section caught Nora's eye. The soil there was darker, softer, as though it had once been disturbed. She knelt, brushing away loose gravel. Beneath a thin layer, her fingers touched something rigid. Bone. The cameraman gasped, pulling back, but Nora steadied herself. She uncovered more. Fragments of a rib, a piece of jaw. Not complete remains, but enough to confirm what many had feared. The chamber had been a grave. They didn't stay long. The air grew thick, the silence unbearable. When they emerged into daylight, Nora felt as though she had crossed a threshold, from suspicion into certainty. The children had died there. That night, she contacted a forensic anthropologist from the University of Wyoming, Dr. Lila Monroe. She shared photos of the bones, the tin box, the note. Dr. Monroe agreed to examine them discreetly. Within weeks, preliminary results came back. The bones were consistent with children aged 10 to 13. Trauma marks suggested blunt force, possibly from a fall or from intentional blows. The note, Dr. Monroe said softly, was the kind of thing that should change an investigation completely. But when Nora forwarded her findings to Sheriff Keller, the response was chilling. "We appreciate your effort, Ms. Yazzie, but without chain of custody or verified excavation, this material isn't admissible." It was the same wall again, the careful, bureaucratic dismissal. Frustrated, Nora turned back to the journal. She reread every entry, looking for overlooked details. One phrase struck her differently now. "Arrangements made for 8. Tomorrow will be final." Arrangements? What kind of arrangements? With who? She dug through school employment rosters again, cross-referencing with local government records. That's when a new connection surfaced. Briggs, the teacher, had a brother-in-law on the county commission in 1990. And Sister Margaret's convent had received a donation from the sheriff's office that same summer, just weeks after the disappearance. Patterns of silence, greased with favors. When Nora showed this to Daniel Gray, the former maintenance worker who had once stayed silent, his hands shook. "It was never about losing the children," he whispered. "It was about keeping them quiet. Those kids, they were going to talk." Nora pressed him. "Talk about what?" Daniel hesitated for a long time. Then he said it, barely audible. About what was happening in that school. It was the first time anyone had spoken it aloud. As the word settled, Nora realized the horror wasn't just that the children had vanished. It was why. The cave wasn't just a hiding place. It was a silencing ground. And the truth, finally within reach, was more devastating than anything she had imagined. After Daniel's words, Nora could no longer see the Red Valley boarding school in the same way. The weathered bricks, the quiet hallways that now stood mostly empty, they were not just relics of assimilation policies, but of something far darker. If the 8 children had been silenced, it meant they had been carrying truths too dangerous for adults to let escape. She began combing through survivor testimonies, speaking to men and women who had once attended the school. Most were reluctant at first, their eyes casting downward as if reopening an old wound was too much. But little by little, stories surfaced. One woman, Marjorie Iron, told Nora, "We were punished for speaking our language, punished for writing letters home. And if someone cried at night, the sisters would come, drag them out of bed. Sometimes they came back, sometimes they didn't." Another, George Littlefeather, described an underground room beneath the gymnasium where misbehaving children were taken. "We called it the pit," he said, his voice trembling. "You'd hear them screaming down there, hours, days, and then silence." Nora checked the blueprints of the school archived in county records. There was indeed a sublevel under the gym, listed officially as storage, but multiple survivors described it as a place of punishment. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Red Valley had not simply been a strict institution. It had been a place of cruelty, silenced by the very people meant to protect children. The hardest account came from an elder named Sarah Begay, whose younger brother David had been one of the 8. She remembered vividly the last day she saw him. He asked me that morning if I thought the teachers could be trusted. I laughed, told him of course not, but I didn't know what he meant. Later, when he didn't come home, I thought maybe he ran, but now I know he was trying to tell me something. He knew. Her tears fell freely. Nora sat quietly, letting the silence carry its weight. From Sarah, Nora also learned about whispers among the students in spring of 1990. Whispers that a group of kids had decided to go to the sheriff with what they'd seen. They had gathered in secret, planning to ride out together to town. That group numbered 8. It made sense now. The journal. The word arrangements. The urgency. These children weren't running away. They were preparing to speak out. But someone stopped them before they could. Nora returned to the sheriff's office with her findings. Keller looked more tired than ever, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight. When she pressed him, he didn't deny the possibility of abuse at Red Valley. He only muttered, "That place, it was always rotten." But no one wanted to believe it. Not the state, not the church. They wanted obedience, not truth. For the first time, Nora saw in him not complicity, but exhaustion, the kind that comes from inheriting a poisoned legacy. Still, exhaustion was not innocence. Nora pushed harder. Briggs, Sister Margaret, Sheriff Harmon, they all knew, didn't they? Keller wouldn't meet her eyes. "You don't know what it was like back then," he said. "Speaking up wasn't an option. People who tried didn't last." That night, Nora sat at her desk, reviewing everything. The note in the tin box, the bones in the cave, the journal, the testimonies. All pointed in the same direction. The 8 children hadn't been lost in some tragic accident. They had been led deliberately into a trap. The motive was clear now, to protect the school, its reputation, and those running it. The method, still obscured in shadow. But one thing gnawed at her most: the bicycles. Why had they been piled so neatly at the cave's mouth? It was as though someone wanted them found, but not the bodies. Someone wanted to tell a story, but a false one. And then she remembered Daniel's admission, that he had seen the bikes leaned against the rocks before Harmon declared the caves empty, which meant someone moved them later. Someone was still managing the story, years after the children were gone. Nora circled 2 names again in her notebook: Briggs, Rourke, both alive, both refusing to talk. They weren't just teachers. They were gatekeepers of a truth that had cost 8 children their lives. And if they had silenced those voices in 1990, what else had they buried in the years before? For the first time, Nora understood that she wasn't just investigating a disappearance. She was prying open a system of cover-ups stretching across decades, touching church, law enforcement, and government alike. And the deeper she went, the more dangerous it would become. The autumn air in Red Valley carried a sharpness that bit at the skin, the kind of cold that felt like a warning. Nora knew she was approaching the heart of the story, and the heart of danger. She focused first on Briggs. The former teacher lived in a modest house on the edge of town, alone. His name had surfaced too many times to be coincidence, in the journal, in survivor testimonies, in payroll records linking him to the summer of 1990. Nora knocked on his door one gray afternoon. At first, there was no answer. Then a shuffling sound, the door opening just a crack. Briggs appeared, older now, stooped, but his eyes sharp and defensive. "I told the police everything back then," he said before she even introduced herself. "No," Nora replied, her voice steady. "You told them nothing." For a moment, he looked ready to slam the door. But something in Nora's presence, maybe her determination, maybe the fact that she was Navajo and carried the faces of the children with her, made him hesitate. He let her in. The house smelled of dust and unwashed clothes. Papers were stacked in leaning towers. Briggs lowered himself into a chair, his hands trembling slightly. "They were going to talk," he muttered, almost to himself. Nora leaned forward. "About what?" His eyes flickered with something. Shame, fear, maybe both. About what happened in that school. What the priests did, what the sisters allowed. They had seen too much. Nora's stomach tightened. "So you stopped them?" Briggs shook his head violently. "No, not me. I tried to warn them, told them not to go to the sheriff. Harmon was never going to protect them. He'd protect the school, always the school." "So who?" Nora pressed. Briggs's voice cracked. "Rourke. He took them. Said he was taking them home. But he didn't. He led them up there, to the ridge." The name landed heavy. Rourke, the bus driver turned groundskeeper, a man whose name had floated at the edges of this mystery since the beginning. He was alive, too, living in a trailer just outside the old mission grounds. Before leaving, Nora asked Briggs one last question. "Why didn't you come forward?" Briggs's eyes watered. "Because Harmon told me if I spoke, it would be my word against the churches, against the sheriff's department, and they'd bury me along with those kids." It was a coward's truth, but a truth nonetheless. 2 days later, Nora drove out to Rourke's trailer. It was falling apart, tin siding rusted, windows patched with plastic. She found him sitting outside in a broken lawn chair, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "I know why you're here," he said, before she even spoke. His voice was gravelly, worn down. "Then tell me," Nora said, standing firm. For a long time, Rourke said nothing. He just stared at the horizon, smoke curling from his cigarette. Finally, he sighed. "They trusted me. That's the worst part. They thought I was helping them, but I had orders." Nora's heart pounded. "Orders from who?" Rourke's jaw clenched. "From Sister Margaret, from Harmon. The kids were going to talk about the beatings, the pit, the things the priests did at night. The church couldn't afford another scandal. The sheriff couldn't afford to look weak. They said it would destroy everything." "So you drove them to the cave," Nora said flatly. Rourke nodded once. "Told them it was a shortcut home. They followed me in, scared but trusting. Margaret was already waiting. Briggs was supposed to be there too, but he backed out. Didn't matter. Margaret. She had a way of making things final." Nora's breath caught. "What happened in there?" Rourke's hands shook as he lit another cigarette. His voice dropped. "They never came out, that's all I'll say." Nora's mind swirled. The bones, the note, the piled bicycles. The story was no longer mystery. It was murder, deliberate, organized, sanctioned by those in power. Rourke looked at her finally, his eyes bloodshot. "I did what I was told. Doesn't make me innocent. But you need to understand, if I had said no, it would have been me too." Nora wanted to scream at him, wanted to demand names, details, everything. But she saw the hollow man before her, already eaten alive by the weight of his choices. He had given her enough. That night, she drove home in silence, the road stretching endlessly under the stars. She pulled over once, clutching the tin box with the child's note inside. "If we don't come back, tell my mom I'm sorry." Now she knew why that note existed. The children had sensed the danger. They had known betrayal was near. The truth was almost complete, but it was not yet justice. For that, Nora would need to bring it all into the light, the journal, the bones, the testimonies, the confessions. And she knew, as she stared into the darkness beyond her windshield, that doing so might cost her as dearly as it had cost the children. The silence in Red Valley after Nora's meeting with Rourke felt different, heavier, as if the town itself knew what truths had finally been pulled into the open. For decades, the disappearance of the 8 children had been a whispered tragedy. Now, it was clear. It was not an accident, not a mystery of nature. It was murder, committed in the name of silence. But knowing the truth and proving it were 2 different things. Nora gathered everything she had, Sarah Begay's testimony about her brother's warnings, Daniel's memory of the bicycles, Briggs's broken confession, Rourke's admission. She packaged it alongside the journal pages, the bones from the cave, the tin box with the note. It was enough to tell a story, but would it be enough to force action? She approached the county attorney's office first. The man behind the desk, Richard Hanlon, was polite but cool. He listened to her presentation without expression, his pen scratching notes on a yellow pad. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Miss Yazzie, what you've uncovered is disturbing, no question. But we're talking about events from nearly 20 years ago. The accused are elderly, the records incomplete, the evidence circumstantial at best." Nora clenched her jaw. "The bones aren't circumstantial. The journal isn't circumstantial. The confessions aren't circumstantial." Hanlon sighed. "I sympathize, truly. But to bring charges, I'd need more. A clear cause of death, a direct witness, documents tying Harmon, Margaret, or the church to an order of silencing. Without that, a defense attorney would shred this in a day." Nora left his office, shaking with anger. She realized then that justice in a courtroom might never come. The systems that had buried the children once were still in place, still shielding the guilty. But there were other forms of justice. She turned to the families, gathering them in a small community hall on the reservation. Mothers, fathers, siblings, now older, but their grief still raw. She laid out the evidence, piece by piece, letting them see what had been hidden. When she finished, the room was silent except for quiet sobbing. One elder stood, his voice trembling. "All these years they told us our children ran away. They told us we were to blame. And all along, it was them." Another woman, her hair silver, whispered, "We kept waiting for answers. Now we have them. Now we can bury them." The families decided they would not wait for the state. They would hold their own memorial, mark their children's resting place, and tell the story themselves. But Nora wasn't done. She returned to Rourke one last time, this time with a recorder. At first, he resisted. But when she told him the families deserved to hear it from someone involved, he broke. His voice cracked as he confessed, in detail, what happened that summer night in 1990. The kids had packed food, blankets. They really thought they were going to make it. They thought I was on their side. We rode out to the caves at dusk. I told them it was safer to hide there till morning. They believed me. Margaret was waiting. She said it had to be done quick. They cried, they begged, but she wouldn't listen. Harmon showed up later. Told us to pile the bikes outside, make it look like they'd hidden and gone deeper in. He said no one would search too hard, because no one ever searched too hard when native kids disappeared. The recording ended in silence. Nora knew it wasn't a courtroom confession, but it was something undeniable. Proof that the disappearance was not fate, it was choice. She gave copies of the recording to the families, to journalists, to anyone who would take it. And soon the story spread. Local papers picked it up, then regional outlets, then national. The phrase Red Valley 8 appeared in headlines, forcing the state and the church to respond. Under pressure, the diocese issued a statement of sorrow and regret, careful not to admit liability. The sheriff's department claimed ignorance, blaming Harmon alone. Harmon himself had died years earlier, beyond reach. But Sister Margaret was still alive, living in a nursing home. When confronted with the allegations, she refused to speak, her lips pressed in a tight line. She died weeks later, never confessing. And yet, the truth was out. The families had their answers. The silence was broken. On the day of the memorial, hundreds gathered near the caves. A drumbeat carried through the valley as names were read aloud, one by one. Mothers and fathers clutched photos, siblings held flowers, grandchildren carried candles. Nora stood among them, the tin box in her hands. When it came time, she read aloud the note inside, the child's last message to his mother. "If we don't come back, tell my mom I'm sorry." The words drifted on the wind, echoing against the rocks. For a moment, it felt as if the voices of the 8 children were finally heard, carried by the community they had been stolen from. Justice in the courts had failed, but truth, at last, had triumphed. As the fire burned into the night, Nora thought of all the years the caves had held their secret. The silence had been terrible, but now, at last, it was broken. The caves were quiet again, but no longer secret. Where once the bicycles had stood like a cruel monument to silence, there was now a memorial. A simple wooden marker with 8 names carved deep into the grain. Families placed flowers there. Children tied ribbons, and prayers rose with the wind. The earth had given up its truth, and with it, some measure of peace. For Nora, the journey had been more than investigative. It had been personal. She thought of her own cousins who had been sent to distant schools, some returning broken, some never returning at all. The story of the 8 was not just their story. It was part of a larger wound carved across generations. In the months after the memorial, reporters came and went. Academics wrote about the case, and activists used it as evidence in calls for national inquiries into missing Indigenous children. But when the cameras left, the families remained, still holding the grief in their homes, in their blood. Nora visited Sarah Begay one evening, sitting with her on the porch as the desert sun sank low. Sarah held a photograph of her brother, taken just days before he vanished. "He would have been 40 now," she said softly, "maybe married, maybe with children of his own." Her voice trembled. "I'm glad the world knows. But it doesn't bring him back." Nora nodded. "No. But it means they can't pretend anymore. They can't say you imagined it. They can't erase them." Sarah squeezed her hand. "That matters." A few weeks later, a gathering was held at the community center. Survivors of the mission school spoke aloud, some for the first time. They told of the pit behind the chapel, the punishments, the nights when footsteps echoed in the dormitories. Each testimony was heavy, but together they formed something unbreakable, a chorus that refused to be silenced. At the end of the evening, an elder stood and looked around the room. "We carry their memory not as weight but as fire," he said. "So our children and their children will never forget. That is justice, too." Nora recorded those words in her notebook, knowing they would stay with her long after the case faded from headlines. She realized then that her role was not just to uncover truth, but to pass it on, to make sure silence never returned. Months later, she returned one last time to the caves. Snow dusted the ground, the air sharp and still. She carried with her the tin box, the child's note inside. Carefully, she placed it at the memorial, beneath the carved names. For a moment, she knelt, resting her hand against the wood. The words echoed in her mind, soft as breath. If we don't come back, tell my mom I'm sorry." Nora whispered into the cold air, as if the children could still hear. "She knows. The world knows. You are not forgotten." As she stood and walked back toward the fading light, the valley stretched silent around her. But it was no longer the silence of erasure. It was the silence of remembrance. Heavy, sacred, eternal. And though justice in courts had slipped away, justice of another kind had been delivered. The truth laid bare, the children named, the silence broken forever. The story of the Red Valley 8 would not vanish again,